I was sitting at my oak desk, going through the monthly ranch reports when Ken walked into my office. He had that look on his face, the one he wore when he thought he'd won something. His chest was puffed out, and he carried a folder of papers like they were made of gold. "Well, Cassandra," he said, using my full name the way he did when he wanted to sound important, "I have some news that's going to change everything." I looked up from my papers and waited. Ken loved his dramatic moments. He lived for them. He slapped the folder down on my desk, hard enough to make my coffee cup rattle. "I've sold the ranch." For a second, I thought I'd heard him wrong. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Sunset Ridge Ranch is sold. All $2 million worth of it." His smile was so wide it looked painful. "I found a buyer who was very motivated." I opened the folder with steady hands. Inside were official-looking documents with lots of legal words and signatures. My eyes found the important line quickly. Sale price, $5, 5 RO. $5. For my $2 million ranch. Ken was watching my face like a hawk watching a mouse. He was waiting for me to scream, to cry, to beg him to explain how this was possible, to fall apart completely. Instead, I read through the papers carefully. Ken had sold my ranch, the ranch I'd built from nothing over 15 years, to someone named Amber Collins for $5. Amber Collins. His little girlfriend thought she was so clever. When I finished reading, I looked up at Ken and smiled. Just smiled. Ken's face changed. The smug look flickered like a candle in the wind. "That's it? That's your reaction?" I leaned back in my chair, still smiling. "What reaction were you expecting?" "I just sold your precious ranch for $5. His voice got louder. "Everything you've worked for is gone. You should be on your knees begging me to fix this." "Should I?" I asked calmly. Ken started pacing around my office like a caged animal. "Yes, you should be crying. You should be asking me how this happened. You should be promising to do anything to get it back." I folded my hands on top of the papers. "But I'm not going to do any of those things." "Why not?" Ken's voice cracked a little. "Because I've been waiting for this moment for months." Ken stopped pacing. His face went pale. "What do you mean?" I stood up slowly and walked to the window that looked out over my beautiful ranch. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. Luis was fixing a fence post near the barn. Everything looked exactly the same as it had this morning. "I mean, exactly what I said, Ken. I've been waiting for you to make this exact move." "That's impossible," he said, but his voice wasn't confident anymore. "You had no idea what I was planning." I turned back to face him. Ken looked smaller somehow, like someone had let the air out of him. "Didn't I?" I asked. Ken stared at me for a long moment. I could see his mind racing, trying to figure out what I knew and when I'd known it. He was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. "You're bluffing," he said finally. "You're trying to save face. But it's too late. The papers are signed. The sale is final. Amber owns this place now, and there's nothing you can do about it." I sat back down at my desk and picked up my coffee cup. "If you say so, Ken." "I do say so," he shouted. "And when you finally understand what you've lost, don't come crying to me. You had your chance to be a good wife, but you chose to be stubborn instead." He grabbed the papers off my desk and stormed toward the door. "Ken," I called softly. He turned around, hope flickering in his eyes. Maybe he thought I was about to break down after all. "Give Amber my congratulations," I said. "I hope she enjoys her new purchase." Ken's face turned red with rage, and he slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. I sat there in the quiet, still smiling, because the game was finally beginning. Looking back, I should have seen the warning signs earlier. But 3 years ago, when I first started transforming my grandmother's old property into something special, Ken seemed like the perfect supportive husband. The land I inherited was nothing special. Just 40 acres of rolling hills with an old farmhouse that needed everything fixed. Most people would have sold it and taken the cash. But something about those hills spoke to me. "Are you sure about this, Cass?" Ken asked the day I told him my plan. "Ranching is hard work and expensive." "I know," I said, looking out at the empty pastures. "But I can see it. Cattle grazing, tourists coming to experience real ranch life, maybe even a wedding venue someday." Ken smiled and put his arm around me. "If anyone can make it work, it's you. You've always been the smart one in this family." Back then, he meant it. I started with 5 acres and 6 head of cattle. I studied breeding programs and bloodlines like I was preparing for a college exam. Every weekend, Ken and I would drive to livestock auctions, where I'd bid on animals that other ranchers overlooked, but I could see had potential. "How do you know which ones to pick?" Ken would ask, watching me examine a young bull. "You look at the bone structure, the muscle development, the way they move," I explained. "Good genetics show in 100 little details." Ken was genuinely interested then. He'd ask questions and remember the answers. When I explained why I was willing to pay extra for a particular cow, he'd nod and support my decisions. The first year, we barely broke even. The second year, we made a small profit. By the third year, I was expanding into agritourism, offering horseback rides, farm-to-table dinners, and overnight stays in the renovated farmhouse. That's when things started to change. Ken loved the money that was coming in, but he didn't love that I was the one making all the decisions. When reporters came to interview me about the fastest-growing agritourism business in the county, Ken would hover nearby, trying to insert himself into the conversation. "My husband has been so supportive," I'd always say, trying to include him. But Ken wanted more than support credit. He wanted control credit. "You know, I was the one who suggested the horseback rides," he told a journalist once, even though that wasn't true. "Cass is great with the business side, but the big picture ideas, that's more my thing." I didn't correct him in front of the reporter, but that night I asked him about it. "Does it matter who had the idea first?" he said. "We're a team. What's good for the business is good for both of us." Except Ken's own businesses kept failing. He'd tried selling insurance, then real estate, then some kind of online marketing scheme. Nothing stuck. Meanwhile, my ranch grew from 6 cattle to 60, from 40 acres to 200, from breaking even to pulling in serious money. Ken's failed ventures made him bitter. He'd make comments about how some people just get lucky or how it's easier to succeed when you don't have real pressure on you. The worst part was watching him take credit for my work with other people. At dinner parties, he'd tell stories about our ranch and our business decisions as if he'd been the driving force behind everything. "Ken's being modest," I'd say. This was all his wife's crazy dream. But Ken wasn't being modest. He genuinely believed he deserved equal credit for something he'd barely participated in. By last year, when the ranch was valued at $2 million, Ken had stopped helping entirely. He'd just started planning how to take it all away. 6 months ago, Ken started acting like a stranger. It began with the phone calls. Ken would be watching TV with me and his phone would buzz. He'd look at it, get this weird expression on his face, and then walk outside to take the call. "Who was that?" I'd ask when he came back in. "Just work stuff," he'd say. But Ken hadn't had steady work in over a year. Then came the late nights. Ken started going out after dinner, claiming he was meeting potential business partners at various bars around town. He'd come home smelling like perfume that wasn't mine and act irritated when I asked how his meetings went. "You wouldn't understand," he'd say. "It's complicated business stuff." But the strangest change was his sudden interest in my ranch paperwork. I'd come into my office and find Ken going through my filing cabinets. When I asked what he was looking for, he'd say something vague about wanting to understand our finances better. One morning, I caught him taking pictures of legal documents with his phone. "Ken, what are you doing?" He jumped like I'd caught him stealing. "Oh, Just making copies for our records. You know, in case something happens to the originals. We have a copy machine, I said slowly. This is faster, he said, but he put the papers away quickly and left the room. Ken started asking strange questions during dinner. Random questions that didn't make sense. Hypothetically, he'd say, cutting his steak, what would happen to the ranch if something happened to you? What kind of something? I don't know, an accident, illness, whatever. Who would inherit everything? Well, legally, you're my husband. Most things would go to you. I watched his face carefully. Why do you ask? Just curious. It's important for couples to plan ahead. A few days later, he brought it up again. You know, Cass, it might be smart to put some of the ranch assets in my name, too, for tax purposes. I set down my fork. What kind of tax purposes? Diversification, spreading the risk. If everything is in one person's name, it can create problems. What kind of problems? Ken waved his hand like I was asking silly questions. Legal problems. Tax problems. Trust me, I've been researching this. Ken had never shown interest in taxes or legal planning before. He'd always been happy to let me handle the boring paperwork stuff. The questions kept coming. How much was the land worth now? Could we get loans against the property? What would happen if we needed to sell quickly? When I asked why he wanted to know, Ken got defensive. Can't a husband be interested in his family's financial security? He'd snap. You act like it's suspicious for me to care about our future. But it was suspicious. Everything about Ken's behavior was suspicious. He started criticizing the way I ran the ranch. You're such a control freak, he said one evening when I mentioned updating our insurance policies. You don't trust anyone else to make important decisions. These are my business decisions to make, I said. Our business decisions. We're married, remember? What's yours is mine. Ken had never talked like that before. In 15 years of marriage, he'd never once suggested that my work belonged to him. You need to learn to trust your husband more, he continued. Marriage is about partnership, about sharing everything. I started paying closer attention to Ken's activities. I noticed he'd been going through my desk when I wasn't home. I found my business credit card statements scattered differently than how I'd left them. My computer had search histories I hadn't created, searches about property laws and marriage rights. Ken was planning something that involved my ranch and my money. I just didn't know what yet. But I was going to find out. The credit card statement arrived on a Tuesday morning that changed everything. I was sorting through the mail when I saw the envelope from our bank. Usually I handled all the finances, but this was Ken's personal credit card, the one he used for his own expenses. The envelope was already opened. Ken must have looked at it first, which was odd because he never paid attention to bills or statements. I pulled out the papers, just curious about what had caught his attention. My blood went cold. Dinner at Romano's, the most expensive restaurant in town. $200. I'd never been to Romano's with Ken. Hotel charges. 3 different hotels over the past month. All of them nice places, the kind with room service and fancy bathrooms. More restaurant charges. Wine that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a week. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair and went through every charge carefully. Ken had spent over $3,000 in the past month on things I knew nothing about. Either Ken was having some kind of midlife crisis, or he was having an affair. I thought about confronting him directly. But something told me to be smarter than that. If Ken was planning something bigger, something involving my ranch, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. That afternoon, I called Harrison Walsh, my lawyer. Harrison, I need to hire a private investigator. Can you recommend someone reliable? Harrison had been my attorney since I started the ranch. He was the kind of man who never asked unnecessary questions. May I ask what kind of investigation you need? The kind that involves a cheating husband and suspicious behavior around valuable assets. I'll have someone contact you within the hour. The investigator's name was Patricia Stone, and she was exactly what I needed. professional, thorough, and invisible. I gave her Ken's photo, his schedule, and copies of the credit card statements. "How long do you think this will take?" I asked. "If he's as careless as these credit card charges suggest, probably not long." She was right. 3 days later, Patricia called me. "Mrs. Thompson, I have what you need. Can you meet me at my office this afternoon?" Patricia's office was small and neat, with filing cabinets that probably held 1,000 secrets. She spread photographs across her desk like a dealer spreading playing cards. Ken and a young blonde woman having dinner at Romano's. Ken and the same woman kissing in a hotel parking lot. Ken and the woman walking hand in hand through downtown, looking like a couple that had been together for years. "Her name is Amber Collins," Patricia said. 28 years old, works as a waitress at Murphy's Bar downtown. She's been seeing your husband for approximately 4 months. I stared at the photos. The woman was pretty in an obvious way. Lots of makeup, tight clothes, long bleached hair. She looked like she was trying very hard to be noticed. "There's more," Patricia continued. "I followed them to several meetings. Your husband has been telling Miss Collins quite a lot about your ranch." "What kind of things?" Patricia pulled out a small recording device. "I was able to get close enough to record some of their conversations. Would you like to hear?" I nodded. Ken's voice came through the speaker, clear and confident. "Once I get rid of Cass, all of this will be ours. The ranch, the money, everything. You'll never have to work another day in your life." Amber's voice was breathy and excited. "Are you sure you can make that happen? What if she fights back?" Ken laughed. "Trust me, baby. I've been researching this for months. There are ways to handle stubborn wives. Legal ways. She won't know what hit her." Patricia turned off the recording. "Mrs. Thompson, I think your husband is planning more than just divorce." I sat there, staring at the photos of my husband with his girlfriend, listening to his voice promising her my life's work. Ken wasn't just cheating on me. He was planning to steal everything I'd built. The morning after hearing those recordings, I called Harrison from my truck, parked far away from the house where Ken couldn't overhear. "Harrison, I need to see you immediately, and I need you to contact Theo Kim." "Theo from your business ventures? What's this about, Cass?" "Ken is planning to steal my ranch. I need to make sure there's nothing left for him to steal." Harrison's office felt like a war room that afternoon. He'd called Theo, who drove down from the city within hours. Theo was one of the smartest people I knew, a tech entrepreneur who'd helped me set up the digital side of my agritourism business. More importantly, he understood complex financial structures. "Here's what we're dealing with," I said, spreading Patricia's photos and recordings across Harrison's conference table. Both men listened to Ken's voice promising Amber my life's work. When the recording ended, Theo shook his head. "He's planning to claim marital rights to assets you built entirely yourself," he said. "Classic financial abuse." Harrison pulled out a legal pad. "What's your timeline, Cass? How long before he makes his move?" "Based on his behavior, I'd say weeks, maybe days. He's getting reckless." "Then we need to move fast," Harrison said. "Theo, can you set up the trust structure we discussed for Cass's other investments?" "Already working on it," Theo said, typing on his laptop. "We can have the paperwork ready by tomorrow." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. We would move all the ranch's valuable assets, the prize cattle, the expensive equipment, the tourism business contracts, into a trust. On paper, the land Ken thought he was stealing would be worthless without these assets. "What about the main property?" I asked. Harrison smiled. "That's where it gets interesting. We're going to subdivide." Over the next 2 weeks, while Ken was busy playing house with Amber, I was busy making his scheme impossible. The most valuable part of my operation was the cattle breeding program. 40 head of prime breeding stock worth over $800,000. Theo's trust quietly purchased them from my ranch corporation. On paper, I no longer owned cattle. I was just managing livestock for an outside investor. The tourism business got similar treatment. The booking contracts, the insurance policies, the brand name, everything moved to separate legal entities that Ken had no claim to. Meanwhile, at home, I played the perfect, unsuspecting wife. "You seem more interested in the ranch lately," I said to Ken one evening, watching him flip through my business files. "I love that you want to be more involved." Ken looked up, surprised. "Really?" "Of course. This place is our future together. You should know how everything works." Ken's whole attitude changed. He started asking direct questions instead of sneaky ones. "How much are those cattle worth exactly?" he asked over breakfast. "The breeding program? About 800,000, depending on market conditions." Ken's eyes lit up. He had no idea those cattle were no longer legally mine. "And the tourism business? That's pulling in about 15,000 a month during peak season." Ken nodded like he was filing away important information. The best part was when he started bringing Amber around. "Cass, I'd like you to meet Amber Collins," he said one afternoon, walking into my office with his girlfriend like it was the most natural thing in the world. "She's a business consultant. I thought she could give us some fresh perspectives on the ranch operation." Amber was exactly what I'd expected from the photos. Young, pretty, and absolutely convinced she was smarter than everyone around her. "This is such a beautiful property," she gushed, looking around my office. "You must be so proud of what you've built here." "Thank you," I said pleasantly. "Ken tells me you're interested in agriculture." "Oh yes," Amber said, shooting Ken a meaningful look. "I think this place has amazing potential." Luis found me later that day near the horse barn. "Boss," he said quietly, "that man and his lady friend were walking around the north pasture this morning. They were talking about the cattle like they owned them." "What did they say?" "The woman kept asking how much everything was worth, and your husband was telling her she'd need to hire new ranch hands once she took over." Once she took over. Ken was already planning the details of his theft with his girlfriend. Perfect. The trap was set. The morning Ken executed his plan, he was humming in the shower. I'd been expecting this for weeks, watching him get more confident and reckless. Last night, he'd stayed out until 2 a.m., claiming he was finalizing some business deals. When he finally came home, he smelled like cheap perfume and expensive champagne. "Big day today," he announced over breakfast, straightening his tie like he was going to an important meeting. "What's the occasion?" I asked, buttering my toast. "Just some paperwork to take care of. Legal stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." Ken had never handled legal paperwork in our entire marriage. He usually claimed it was too boring and left everything to me. An hour after he left, Luis came running up to the house. "Boss, there's a county clerk out here with some official-looking papers. Says he needs to do a property inspection." My heart started beating faster. This was it. The clerk was a nervous young man who kept checking his watch. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to verify the property boundaries for a legal transfer. Standard procedure." "What kind of transfer?" "A sale, ma'am. Says here the property is being transferred to," he checked his clipboard, "Amber Collins." I pretended to be confused. "There must be some mistake. This property isn't for sale." "Well, ma'am, I just processed the paperwork. If you have questions about the sale, you'd need to speak with the current legal owner." "I am the current legal owner." The clerk looked uncomfortable. "According to these documents, the sale was authorized by Kenneth Thompson as the primary property manager with power of attorney." Power of attorney. Ken had somehow created fake documents giving himself legal control over my property. 2 hours later, Ken came home with Amber and a folder full of papers. They were both grinning like they'd won the lottery. "Cass, we need to talk," Ken said, walking into my office with his chest puffed out. That's when he delivered his bombshell about selling my ranch for $5. But I already knew what was happening. While Ken thought he was being clever, I'd been 3 steps ahead of him for weeks. After Ken stormed out, I called Harrison. "It's done," I said. "Ken just executed his plan exactly like we thought he would." "The fake power of attorney?" "Yes. And he sold the ranch to his girlfriend for $5, just like Patricia heard him planning. Harrison chuckled. Does he have any idea what he actually sold? Not a clue. Ken's plan was actually clever in a criminal sort of way. He'd researched an obscure law that allowed a spouse to claim emergency property management rights under certain circumstances. Then he'd forged documents claiming I was mentally incompetent to handle business decisions. His girlfriend Amber had provided a fake loan application showing she had access to significant funds, making her appear to be a legitimate buyer. On paper, it looked like a real estate transaction between willing parties. Ken's strategy was to force me into a lengthy legal battle to prove the sale was fraudulent. While I was tied up in court, he planned to liquidate any other assets he could get his hands on. By the time I could prove the sale was fake, Ken and Amber would be long gone with whatever money they could steal. It was actually a smart plan, if he'd been dealing with someone who wasn't expecting it. That evening, I watched through my window as Ken and Amber celebrated on what they thought was now her property. They were drinking champagne on my front porch, making plans for their new life together. We did it, baby, I heard Ken say as they walked past my window. Tomorrow we start liquidating the cattle and equipment. By next week, we'll have enough cash to disappear wherever we want. I can't believe how easy that was. Amber laughed. Your wife didn't even fight back. I thought she was supposed to be some kind of business genius. She's book smart, Ken said. But she's not street smart like us. They had no idea they'd just stolen absolutely nothing. Tomorrow, I would show them exactly how street smart I really was. The next morning, Ken and Amber showed up at my door with a sheriff's deputy and an eviction notice. You have 24 hours to remove your personal belongings, Ken announced, waving the papers like a victory flag. This property now belongs to Miss Collins. Amber stood beside him, wearing a new outfit that probably cost more than most people made in a week. She'd clearly been shopping with Ken's credit cards, getting ready for her new life as a wealthy ranch owner. I'm sorry it has to be this way, Cass, Ken said, not looking sorry at all. But you brought this on yourself. If you'd been a better wife, if you'd trusted me more, none of this would have happened. The sheriff's deputy looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, I'm just here to serve papers. If you have legal objections to this eviction, you'll need to take that up with the courts. Actually, I said calmly, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Could you give me just a moment? I walked back into my house and returned with my own folder of papers. Harrison was already driving up the driveway. I'd called him an hour ago. Ken, I said, before the deputy finishes his work, I think you and Amber should understand exactly what you've purchased. Ken's confident smile flickered. What are you talking about? Harrison joined us on the porch, carrying his briefcase. Good morning, everyone. I'm Harrison Walsh, Mrs. Thompson's attorney. I believe there may be some confusion about this property transfer. There's no confusion, Amber snapped. I bought this ranch fair and square. I have the papers to prove it. Yes, you do have papers, Harrison agreed. And the sale is completely legal. You now own exactly what you paid for. Harrison opened his briefcase and pulled out a land survey map. Miss Collins, you are now the proud owner of Plot 247B, a 0.3-acre parcel of undeveloped land. Congratulations. Amber stared at the map. What? No, I bought the whole ranch, 200 acres. I'm afraid not, Harrison said gently. Mrs. Thompson subdivided this property 6 months ago. The main ranch, the buildings, the cattle operation, those are all separate legal entities now. Ken's face went white. That's impossible. I saw the original property deeds. This whole place was one piece of land. It was, I said, until I legally divided it into separate parcels. The land you sold to Amber is that little strip over there by the road. It's worth exactly $5. I pointed to a tiny patch of scrubby grass that wouldn't support a single cow. The cattle you were planning to liquidate? They belong to the Theo Kim Investment Trust now. I sold them months ago. The tourism business? That's owned by Sunset Hospitality LLC, a completely separate company. The equipment, the buildings, the profitable parts of this operation, all legally transferred to various entities that have nothing to do with this land sale. Ken was breathing hard, his face getting redder by the second. You can't do that. You can't just move assets around to cheat me. I didn't cheat anyone, I said. I protected my assets from theft. Which, by the way, is exactly what you attempted to do. I turned to the sheriff's deputy. Officer, I believe Mr. Thompson has committed several crimes here. Identity fraud for forging power of attorney documents. Attempted grand theft for trying to steal a $2 million property. And fraud for creating false documents to deceive Miss Collins. The deputy was suddenly paying much closer attention. Ma'am, do you have evidence of these crimes? Harrison handed him a thick folder. Security camera footage of Mr. Thompson going through private files, recorded conversations detailing the plan to steal Mrs. Thompson's assets, and forensic evidence showing the power of attorney documents were forged. Amber was staring at her purchase papers like they were written in a foreign language. Wait, so I don't own the ranch? I just bought a tiny piece of empty land? For $5, I confirmed, which honestly was probably overpaying. Ken! Amber shrieked. You told me I was buying a $2 million ranch. You said we'd be rich. I thought I was, Ken shouted back. She tricked us. No, I said quietly. I outsmarted you. There's a difference. As the deputy called for backup to arrest Ken for fraud, I watched my husband's face crumble. Everything he'd planned, everything he'd schemed for, had blown up in his face. Ken lost his freedom, his reputation, and any claim to my assets. Amber lost her $5 and faced charges as an accomplice to fraud. And I kept everything I'd worked for. Sometimes the best revenge is just being smarter than the people trying to hurt you.